Can you still hear me, Hans?
I can hear you just fine.
Perfect. Okay, we are live on YouTube and attendees are filtering in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kobe Rizik, and I'm the president of the Buckley program. Also online this afternoon, we have our outreach director, Emma Miller, who is moderating this event alongside me. Welcome to this Zoom lecture titled Election Fraud, Myth and Reality with Mr. Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation. Before we introduce Mr. von Spakovsky formally, we want to say a few words about the Buckley program. First, for those of you who do not know, the William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a Buckley Fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible to be fellows, and if you're currently a fellow, please share this opportunity with your peers.
Now, on to Mr. von Spakovsky. Hans von Spakovsky is an authority on a wide range of issues, including civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment, immigration, the rule of law, and government reform. As a senior legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, he also manages the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative. He is the co-author with John Fund of the book, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk, and Obama's Enforcer, Eric Holder's Justice Department. President Donald Trump appointed von Spakovsky to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity in 2017. Before joining Heritage in 2008, von Spakovsky served 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission, the authority charged with enforcing campaign finance laws for congressional and presidential elections, including public funding. Previously, von Spakovsky worked at the Justice Department as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. His analysis and commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, The Hill, and USA Today, as well as such outlets as National Review Online and Fox News. His series for PJ Media was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. A 1984 graduate of Vanderbilt University School of Law, von Spakovsky received a bachelor's degree in 1981 from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He currently resides in Vienna, Virginia. We will allot the first 20 minutes or so this afternoon for Mr. von Spakovsky to give his remarks, and then move right into questions from the moderators and the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please submit it in writing using the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will do our best to end the event at 5:30 p.m. With that, please join me in warmly welcoming Mr. Hans von Spakovsky to the Buckley program. Mr. von Spakovsky, you may begin when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. I did want to explain to folks that you're not seeing video of me today because I live in Northern Virginia and a severe thunderstorm came through here. And about an hour ago, the power went out in my house. And so my Wi-Fi connection went down along with my laptop. So I am calling in on my iPhone and I have no idea when that is going to get fixed. I appreciate the invitation to talk about election integrity. You know, there's a lot of debates, disputes about there with many folks, particularly on progressive left, saying, "Oh, there's no voter fraud in the country." Look, in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision in a case involving the constitutionality of a photo ID law that had been passed by the state of Indiana that required all voters voting in person to show one of a number of different forms of ID when they voted. The Supreme Court issued a decision in which one of the points that it made when it upheld the law as being perfectly constitutional and not a burden on voters was that the U.S. has a long history of voter fraud. It's been documented by historians and journalists, and it could make the difference in a close election. And that's the key. You know, those who are opposed to any kind of security measures in the election area are constantly saying, well, you know, we have billions of votes and there's just not enough fraud to ever make a difference. But what they're overlooking is the fact that we have many, many close elections in this country all the time. That's particularly true at the local level. Town council races, city mayoral races, county commission races are often decided by a very small number of votes. And that's where fraud can make a difference. Anyone who doubts that, quickly take a look at just two things. Right now, the election results in Paterson, New Jersey are in question. They had a municipal election there several weeks ago. The Attorney General has charged 4 local individuals with absentee ballot vote fraud, and the fraud is such that, as I said, the results of the election are in doubt. In 2018, you may recall that there was a contested congressional race after the elections. This was in the 9th Congressional District of North Carolina. The winning candidate won by only 900 votes. However, the State Board of Elections started investigating after allegations surfaced, particularly again of absentee ballot fraud. And they conducted a massive investigation, speaking to dozens and dozens and dozens of voters and witnesses and others. And the end result was that they overturned the election results. A particular individual, a political consultant, along with 6 of his staffers, were arrested and indicted for engaging in a widespread absentee ballot fraud scheme. And the election, like I said, was overturned and a new election was held. So how big of a problem is this? Well, we don't really know because there's never been a study going all across the country to try to figure this out. And it's not, I'm not sure that's actually possible. Well, what I can say about it is that we started a database at the Heritage Foundation just a couple of years ago. It is not a comprehensive database. But what it contains is a sampling of proven voter fraud cases from across the country, mostly in the last 20 years, although there are just a couple of older cases in it. By proven, I mean someone was either convicted in a court of law of engaging in fraud, or an election was overturned by a judge because the judge found fraud in the election such that the election should be overturned, or there was an official finding, such as in the North Carolina case that I just mentioned, in the congressional race of the 9th Congressional District. We're up to almost 1,300 cases. And what I will tell you about that is this is a microcosm of the potential cases out there, because it's hard to detect this kind of fraud until something happens, some mistake is made, or someone comes forward to talk about it. And prosecutors, unfortunately, are too often reluctant to do anything about it. I mean, I personally know of literally thousands of other potential cases that have not been investigated and prosecuted. And I'll just give you 2 examples of that to show you what I mean. Like I said, our database right now is about 1,300. It could easily be 10,000 cases if prosecutors and election officials had done something about a particular report that came out after the 2016 election. This was a report by the Government Accountability Institute, which is a nonprofit organization down in Florida. And here's what they did. they obtained the voter registration and voter histories from 21 states. That information is public information. It's candidates and political parties get that all the time. That's how they organize their races. And they took that information from 21 states, which represented about 17% of the registered voters in the country, according to the report. And then they supplemented that voter registration information with commercial data from commercial databases. I think all of you probably would be shocked, but not surprised, at how much information commercial databases have on you. And by doing that, they were able to supplement the voter registration information to get the full Social Security numbers of registered voters. They then ran a comparison, and they discovered that 8,500 individuals had illegally voted in more than one state in the 2016 election. It's not illegal to be registered in more than one state. People often, unfortunately, have that result because people move a lot. And when you register in the new state you've moved to, the old state doesn't always get that information and realize they should take you off the list. But it is illegal to register to vote in the same election in two different states. So just this one report, 8,500 individuals through this comparison. And like I said, the comparison was full name, birth date, and full Social Security number. So we're not going to get any false positives in that kind of comparison. So these people all illegally voted in more than one state in the 2016 election. Not a single election official in any of those 21 states contacted the Government Accountability Institute to ask for the names of those voters so they could investigate and take them off their voter list. And not a single law enforcement official in any of those states called and asked for the names of those voters so they could investigate and potentially prosecute. Another just quick example of this is I was on a county election board in Fairfax County, Virginia, about 10 years ago. And we discovered that about 300 non-citizens, now these are aliens who are in the country legally, had, however, illegally registered to vote in our county. About half of them had actually cast votes illegally in the county. We took them off our voter registration list and forwarded information about this to both the state or county, it's called the Commonwealth Attorney in Virginia. So this is basically the county's district attorney, because for an alien to vote in Virginia is a violation of state law. We also sent this information to the U.S. Justice Department because it is a felony under federal law for a non-citizen to register or vote in American elections. Neither the Commonwealth attorney, prosecutor, nor the Justice Department did anything about this. Again, this was potentially 300 cases of election fraud that they did nothing about. If just these two cases I'm talking about had been pursued by prosecutors, our database potentially would not have 1,300. It would probably be closer to 11,000 cases in it. And this is to show you how, unfortunately, prosecutors don't often do something about it. Another quick example of that is going back again to North Carolina and the 9th Congressional District, where the political consultant and 6 of the staffers have been charged for the fraud they engaged in the 2018 election. Election officials actually had information that this same political consultant, who has worked for numerous candidates in the state of North Carolina, both Republican and Democrat, that he had engaged in exactly the same kind of behavior in 2016. They forwarded information about that to prosecutors after the 2016 election. Prosecutors did nothing about it. If they had, he hopefully would not have been available as a political consultant to carry on this kind of activity in the 2018 election. The point of all this is that, look, there are plenty of elections around the country that where no fraud occurs, and the person that gets the most votes is fairly counted as the winner. But enough fraud occurs in races around the country that we need to be concerned about it, and we need to take steps to try to ensure it doesn't happen. One of the most obvious ones, of course, is to require an ID. Now, you've been hearing for years that supposedly suppresses the votes, particularly minority voters. That's not true. We know it's not true because those ID laws have been in place now in places like Georgia and Indiana for more than a decade. We have 10 years worth of turnout data, and that turnout data shows it does not keep voters out of the polls. We also should be requiring proof of citizenship when individuals register to vote to prevent the problem that is now occurring all over the country of people who aren't citizens. They can easily register and easily vote, and their chances of getting caught are very slim. But the other big problem we have is illustrated by the GAO report of people registering in more than one state and illegally registering in more than one state. If just one voter does that, can it affect an election? Well, probably not. But on the other hand, about a decade ago, I think it was 2012, an individual who ran for Congress in Maryland, her name was Wendy Rosen. She actually won the Democratic congressional primary, was going to be challenging the incumbent Republican congressman in that particular congressional race, until someone apparently in her own political party did opposition research on her and discovered that she was not only registered to vote in Maryland, where she was running for office, but she was also registered to vote in Florida, where, you know, like a lot of Northeasterners, she and her husband had a second home. But what made it worse was that she had also voted in both states in multiple elections. She pled guilty to voter fraud. She was forced out of the race. The Democratic Party picked another individual to replace her. But the point of the story is election officials did not discover this. They had no idea that this individual had been voting in both states in multiple elections. She probably could have gotten away with this forever, except that she decided to run for office and someone did opposition research on her. That shows just one of the typical kinds of problems. We are constantly adding new cases to our database. Just this week, we added in another case of a gentleman who did exactly the same thing, voted by absentee ballot in two different states in the same election. So it's something we should be concerned about, and it's something that both members of both parties should be concerned about, because a lot of the cases, if you look at them on our database, and this is available on our website, you know, many of the cases are not folks in one political party stealing from folks in the other political party. Often it's cases where folks in the same political party are stealing from each other. Just last week, I published a paper, it's a case study of 4 absentee ballot fraud cases. I think Kobe may have sent that around to everyone. 4 elections that were overturned because of absentee ballot fraud. And in one of the cases in Indiana, the fraud occurred in a Democratic mayoral primary, and it was one of the Democratic candidates stealing votes from the other candidate. That case also demonstrates another unfortunate aspect of this, which is particularly with absentee ballot fraud. And the problem with absentee ballots is that they are voted outside of the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers, destroying the transparency as far as American elections and making voters vulnerable to being coerced, pressured, and intimidated in their homes by candidates and party activists and others. But that Indiana case demonstrated, unfortunately, often the voters who are targeted, particularly in absentee ballot fraud schemes, are the poor, less informed, and minority voters. And that was part of that Indiana case, the judge noted that's who the candidate and his cronies targeted in that election. So we want to make sure that everybody who's eligible to vote is able to vote. But we also want to be sure that their vote isn't diluted or stolen by a fraudulent vote or some kind of other fraudulent activity, whether it's by another voter or by an election official or someone else. So I think I've used up my 20 minutes. I'll be happy to now answer questions.
I'll offer the first question here. Why does the media seem to differentiate so-called mail-in voting from absentee voting? Is there really a distinction to be made here? And if not, why has the term absentee voting suddenly been replaced with the term mail-in voting?
Well, that's a good question, but there is a difference. Here's the difference. Look, in 45 states and the District plus the District of Columbia, absentee ballots are made available. All of those states, the District of Columbia, have in-person voting. But if in about 2/3 of the states, if you want to vote by absentee ballot, you can request one. But you don't get it automatically sent to you. You have to fill out an absentee ballot request form. You fill it out with your name, your registration address. You have to sign it, and you have to send that in, which gives election officials the ability to authenticate the absentee ballot request. They will compare your signature, for example, on the absentee ballot request form with your signature that they have on file from when you registered to vote to make sure that it's really the registered voter requesting it. They then will mail you an absentee ballot form for you to fill out. In about 2/3 of the states, you don't need an excuse to vote by absentee. In about 1/3 of the states, you do need an excuse, such as that you're physically disabled, or you're too sick, or perhaps you are an American diplomat or a member of the military stationed overseas. And then, of course, you can vote by absentee ballot. That is different than mail-in balloting or mail-in elections. 5 states, including Washington and Oregon, have entirely switched to all mail elections. So there aren't any open polling places where you can go vote. What they do is they simply mail a mail-in or absentee ballot to every single registered voter in the state. Now, the problem with that is that, as I think I may have said, registered voter lists around the country are in terrible shape. There are many, many counties that do such a poor job of cleaning up their voter lists. And by cleaning up, what I mean is, not taking off people who are eligible to vote, but taking off folks who have moved out of state or have died or otherwise become ineligible to vote. They don't do a good job of that. So if you are mailing out a ballot to every registered voter, you may be mailing them out to individuals who no longer live at a particular house, which puts these ballots out. The ballots are a very valuable commodity. And if they're arriving in neighborhoods for people who no longer live there, unfortunately, some folks might be willing to take those up and to try to vote them. Plus, you have the problem with all mail elections of misdelivery by the U.S. Postal Service. And if you doubt that that's a problem, again, Google what happened recently in the primaries held in Maryland, the District of Columbia, and in Wisconsin. They had big problems in all 3 of those jurisdictions because many voters who requested mail-in ballots or absentee ballots, they weren't delivered in time by the U.S. Postal Service for them to vote. And in fact, some voters didn't get them delivered at all. There's a particular story about Wisconsin of how 3 large tubs of absentee ballots were discovered in a mail processing facility after the election. Those absentee ballots or mail-in ballots had never been delivered to voters. And that's a problem with all mail elections. You're basically, I'd rather be in a polling place where I see myself and I know I'm slipping my ballot that I've marked into the ballot box rather than handing it over to the U.S. Postal Service and hoping that they will get it delivered back in time to be counted. And that's just one of the problems with mail-in elections.
Thank you, Mr. Von Spakovsky, for that answer. My next question, oh, and before I ask, I just want to give a quick reminder to the audience to go ahead and submit their questions. We have about 35 minutes left, so after I ask this, we're hopefully going to move into the audience portion. So if you have a question, please go ahead and submit it on the Zoom Q&A feature. My question is, shouldn't stopping voter fraud be a bipartisan issue? And is there any evidence that voter fraud even benefits one party over the other? If not, why wouldn't both parties be equally invested in stopping it?
Look, that's a great question. And what's unfortunate about this is that it used to be a bipartisan issue. And again, anyone who doubts that, take a look. I think it was right after the 2000 election, the one between Al Gore, of course, and George Bush that was so controversial and resulted in a big litigation fight. There was a federal task force on election reform that was formed by former Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Republican Secretary of State James Baker. And that study is still available up on the web, and folks should take a look at it. I mean, they basically go through all of the issues and problems, many of which I've talked about. And in fact, both Jimmy Carter and James Baker, in their final report, recommended, for example, that people should have to show an ID when they vote, the same way everybody in Europe and other Western democracies has to, or the way people do in Mexico, a country much poorer than ours. So that's a good example of how this issue was very bipartisan. What's unfortunately happened in the last 10 or 20 years since then is that it's become unbipartisan, and all these folks on the progressive left suddenly see any effort to ensure the integrity of the election as somehow a supposed effort to suppress votes. That is just not the case. Does it benefit any particular party? If you look at our database, you'll find the folks in there convicted of voter fraud who are Republican, who are Democrat, and people who are independent. I don't think it particularly benefits one party or the other, although I will say that one of the things that has changed is this. A lot of voter fraud was committed in the 1930s and 1940s by Republicans because they controlled the big urban centers. They controlled the machine in places like Kansas City and elsewhere. As Democrats started to take over politically the big urban cities, which occurred all over the country, including places like Philadelphia, they inherited and took over those machines and started engaging in the same kind of behavior as the Republicans had. And unfortunately, some of that still goes on. Just about a month ago, the U.S. attorney in Philadelphia arrested, charged, and accepted a guilty plea from an election official in Philadelphia who had been bribed by a local political consultant to literally stuff the ballot box in the precinct where he worked for particular candidates. So that's a sign that unfortunately ballot box stuffing still goes on, and this official just admitted that he had done it for numerous candidates in Philadelphia.
Thank you.
So kind of jumping off that point about the machine, I'm from Chicago, so this is still very relevant to me. But
yeah.
A lot of younger people trying to jump into politics, and especially local elections, have had like huge pushbacks against even getting their name on the ballots or on the primary ballot. Last year in an alderman election, we had like 1,000 or 1,500 fake signatures discovered on like a petition to not allow a candidate on the ballot. So I'm wondering, what sort of connections you see between sort of those issues and then later on, election fraud and ballot fraud in the general election or the primary election, and sort of what other indicators we should look at for when elections are going to be defrauded.
Well, that brings up two issues. One is the difficulty of becoming a candidate in some states. And that is, unfortunately, because the political parties in many states that have dominated those states, and this is both the Democratic and Republican parties, they are the ones that have passed statutes governing how the name of someone gets onto the ballot to run for office. And in some states, the party that's been the predominant party in that state has made it as difficult as possible for candidates who come from other parties, independents, to get on the ballot. I mean, the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, I think, have filed numerous lawsuits around the country over this very issue. And I actually, I'm not a Libertarian, I'm not a Green Party member, but I actually agree with them that many of the rules I perceive are too restrictive. Unfortunately, ballot petition fraud is not that unusual. In fact, a lot of folks don't know about this, but I actually have a Heritage paper. It's a case study, which folks can get off the Heritage website, about ballot petition fraud that occurred, just like what you're talking about, in 2008 in Indiana. And there, what occurred was that you have to get a certain number of signatures of registered voters to be a candidate on the ballot. And after the 2008 election, a college student was actually doing a term paper, and he got hold of the ballot petition forms that had put Barack Obama on the ballot in the primary in the state when he was running against Hillary Clinton. And this college student noticed that the signatures looked very much alike. He brought it to the attention of one of the newspapers out there. They hired a handwriting expert. The handwriting expert went through and basically opined that hundreds of the signatures of voters had been forged. This was turned over to law enforcement, and 4 local individuals, leaders in the Democratic Party, a county organization, were convicted. They were the ones who had forged the signatures in order to get Barack Obama on the ballot there. I mean, Barack Obama didn't know anything about it. This was locals doing this. But the point of that story is that, again, this wasn't discovered by election officials. No one would ever have known about it if it weren't for the fact that this one particular college student decided to do a paper on this and had no idea what he was going to find when he was looking at it. And how often does that happen? I don't know, but that's an example, and the one you just talked about, that I think it happens far more often than we would like it to.
Thank you again for that great answer. Our next question is also from the audience, and it's, aside from voter fraud, it would seem that a fair and informed election should be based on all voters having access to the same information upon which they can base their votes. In voting by mail or over an extended period, earlier voters inherently vote on less information than those who vote on election day. Why do you think the issue of uninformed early voting is not emphasized in discussions of election integrity?
I tell you, I totally agree with that. And in fact, I talk about this a lot. I don't think enough other folks in this area talk about that. In fact, I published a Heritage paper not too long ago about the whole new phenomena of early voting, criticizing it over that very thing. Early voting started in Texas in the late 1980s, and today more than 2/3 of the states have early voting, meaning that people can go vote either in person or by absentee ballots anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to 4 weeks before an election. And of course, there's 2 huge problems with that. particularly during primaries. All you have to do is look at the Super Tuesday primary that occurred this year in March. Remember, the Super Tuesday primary occurred before the whole COVID-19 problem shut down the country. More than a dozen states held primaries on Super Tuesday. And as you know, there was a fierce fight going on in the Democratic Party over who would be the nominee. Yet 2 days, only 2 days before Super Tuesday, Senator Klobuchar and former Mayor Pete Buttigieg dropped out of the race. Well, that meant that in many of the states that have early voting, including places like California and others, and Texas too, anyone who voted for either of them, either through early voting or by an absentee ballot, had basically wasted their vote. They could not pull it back. And at one point, I took a look at how many folks had voted for the two candidates who weren't in the race on election day through that process. And literally hundreds of thousands of individuals wasted their vote. The same thing is true as a general election. As the questioner quite rightly says, all you have to do is look at past elections to see many, many instances of really important information, often scandalous information, coming out about a particular candidate right before election day. Well, if you voted early or you voted by absentee ballot, weeks before the election, and information comes out just before election day that is important to the choice you made, again, it's too late. You can't change your vote. You can't pull back your vote. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems with this trend towards earlier and earlier voting, which I think is just not a good idea.
Thank you.
Sort of on that question again, as we move into the future, one fix proposed for this could be using like technology and computers to do those sort of elections. Do you think that's feasible and something that could sort of solve this problem of delayed information, or are there too many risks with using technology in our elections?
Well, I think what you're asking about is internet voting, and there's almost, while there's not bipartisan agreement about things like voter ID, there's almost universal agreement that internet voting is a bad idea. The first task force to look at internet voting, which people were starting to say, oh, this is a great idea, it'll increase turnout, people can vote from their homes. The first task force on this was about 20 years ago, and it was put in place by the California Secretary of State. And he pulled in some of the world's greatest experts on computer software and computer hardware from Silicon Valley, which, as you know, is the heart of the computer industry in the entire world. And he assumed that this task force would come back and say, internet voting is a great idea. And all these computer experts would say, yes, we should go this way. The exact opposite happened. This task force reported that the security problems that are inherent in the way the internet is designed and inherent in the kind of software, the ubiquitous software that people everywhere use, made it too dangerous to vote over the internet. The security problems could not be surmounted given the software being used and the design of the internet. Every task force that has looked at this since, including one put together by the National Science Foundation, has come to exactly the same conclusion. And one of the best examples of this, which I urge folks to Google and read because it's actually kind of funny, but it shows the dangers of it, is some years ago, the District of Columbia decided to put in an internet voting system for residents of DC who were not in DC, or people who were abroad and elsewhere. They hired a contractor who told them they could put in a completely secure system. They put in the system. DC, the District of Columbia election officials were so sure of the fact that this system could not be hacked or could not be broken that they set up a mock election and challenged any hacker anywhere to try to break into their system. A computer science professor at the University of Michigan assigned this as a project to his graduate class. Within 48 hours, they had broken into the system, were ranging all around on the inside of it. Neither the contractor nor the DC election officials had any idea that they were inside the system. And the only way that DC finally figured out that they had hacked into the system was that, for those of you who have voted on an electronic voting machine, you know that once you've marked your votes and you push the button to cast your votes, a screen comes up on the computer saying, "Thank you for voting." Well, some people who were casting ballots in this mock election apparently contacted the DC election officials and said, "What's that song that's playing when the thank you comes up at the end of the screen after I voted?" The DC election folks had no idea what they were talking about, and they discovered that the Michigan folks had reprogrammed the system so that when you finished voting, it played the University of Michigan fight song. And that's how they finally figured out that these computer hackers had gotten inside the system. They could have changed the votes. They could have done whatever they wanted to, and apparently DC would never have known it happened. I don't think anyone has tried to do it since then because of the obvious problems with internet voting.
Thank you, Mr. von Spakovsky. So one thing we haven't exactly touched on is the COVID-19 angle of all this. So a question from the audience we've had is, some governors who in the initial depths of the COVID lockdown initially signaled that they'd favor mail-in elections, like Governor Hogan of Maryland, for example, they now seem to be walking that idea back and be heading toward traditional open polls with some absentee ballots. Will there be too much political pressure in blue states to avoid a substantial mail-in election?
I hope not, and let me talk about that. One of the reasons I think Hogan is walking that back is because they actually tried to do that in the Maryland primary, which was just held recently, and they had huge problems in the state because the absentee ballots that had been requested by many voters were sent out late or never arrived. And look, no matter what you think about mail-in or absentee ballots from the standpoint of misdelivery by the Postal Service or how easy or how hard fraud is to occur, it's impractical to switch to an all-mail election in a big state like Maryland between now and the November election. The state of Washington, which switched to all-mail elections, the Secretary of State there has said publicly it took them 5 years to gear up to be able to handle the literally millions of ballots that you have to send in the mail and are returned in the mail. And there's simply no way that a big state like Maryland or a big state like Georgia, which has about 6.5 million voters, will be able to convert all the way over to mail-in elections. I'm telling you, it would be a disaster and it would be chaos. But here's the other thing. There are numerous examples of jurisdictions holding elections with in-person voting under far worse conditions. I actually did a study for the Heritage Foundation about that, in which I looked at and talk about the fact that Liberia held in-person national elections in 2014 in the midst of the Ebola epidemic that was sweeping West Africa, a much more dangerous disease. And they did it safely. There was no spike in Ebola infections through that election. Well, how did they do it? They did it by putting into polling places all of the safety protocols that health experts have recommended, all the things that we are all doing today, line spacing, sanitation stations inside and outside the polling place, use of disposable materials like disposable pens to mark ballots, cleaning each voting booth both before and after a voter goes in. They were able to do that successfully. Wisconsin on April 7th was able to do it successfully. Yes, a lot of voters voted by absentee ballot, but over 300,000 Wisconsinites voted in person on April 7th. And the health reports issued after that by experts indicate there was no spike in COVID-19. Again, because they went through elaborate safety precautions to make sure people would be able to vote. Similarly, South Korea on April 15th of this year held in-person elections. 29 million South Koreans voted. And again, health authorities there say there was no spike in COVID-19, again, because of the safety precautions they took. I recently voted in my town council elections in the small town I live in Virginia, which is right outside of Washington, D.C., in person. And I'll tell you, I felt safer in the polling place than I do when I go to my grocery store or my pharmacy, which I do regularly, because the safety precautions in the polling place were even better than what I've been seeing at the grocery store and elsewhere. So we can have in-person voting, and we ought to not eliminate that option for people who don't want to vote through the mail.
Thank you. So assuming we do go by your recommendation and encourage people to vote in person in polls, I would venture a guess that more people, especially older people who normally do vote in person, will register for absentee ballots, making this issue, of course, still relevant. Do you think that the mail-in voting fraud issues are better solved and addressed by litigating them in court, or could Congress step in and issue some sort of federal legislation to address these issues? Or like, would states even be subject to all those rules, given they can make so many of their own decisions about how mail-in elections take place?
Yeah, I think it would be overstepping the grounds for Congress to get into that. The responsibility for federal elections in the Constitution is split between the federal government and state governments. And state governments have enormous authority to administer their own elections, as long as they're doing it in a manner that is not, of course, racially discriminatory, and therefore violates the Voting Rights Act. I think this is an issue that each state should decide on its own. And the best way to do that, frankly, is not through litigation. It is through the democratic process. It is through elected representatives in the state legislatures, representing, independents, Democrats, Republicans, deciding after listening to what their constituents are saying, what is the best way to do that. A federal mandate might not only not be unconstitutional, but a one-size-fits-all policy from the federal government is not usually a good idea.
Thank you again. The next question is, you mentioned earlier on in the call about cleaning up voter lists in many counties around the country. Right. How do you recommend counties and governments can clean up their voter lists? And is there any way to increase pressure on them to do this?
I've made a lot of recommendations on this. And, the most astonishing thing about this is how election officials all over the country don't use modern technology in the way that they should. I mean, to give you another example of this, I talked earlier about, look, there's all kinds of other databases that they should be using. Election officials should be running their voter registration lists against the database in every state of public assistance, people who, apply for welfare. They should be running it against DMV, the driver's licensing records. All of those can be used to do everything from checking to make sure that it's a real person who really lives at the particular address they've registered at, that they're actually alive and not dead. And they don't use those databases the way they should. Another just quick example of this is that election officials don't use county tax record databases either. Now, you're saying, why should they do that? Well, because under every state's law, you are mandated, you have to register where you live. You cannot register at a business. You cannot register where you work. You have to register where you reside. Now, that's where you're eligible to vote. Yet, that Government Accountability Institute study that I talked about at the very beginning, this is the one where, they found 8,500 people who had illegally registered and voted in more than one state. The other thing they did was in comparing registered voter addresses with their databases, they found something like 15,000 addresses of registered voters that were everything from UPS stores to businesses to basketball courts to vacant lots. Well, if counties, as you know, their biggest thing they want to do is collect taxes. So they have tax records on every single piece of property in their county. And they know if a particular address is a commercial property or a residential property. They know if it's got a house on it or if it's a vacant lot because different tax rates apply. And yet they don't use that information to check the registered addresses of people when they're registering to vote to make sure that this person is actually registering at an apartment or a condominium or a house rather than registering at a UPS store or a vacant lot. And that problem wouldn't occur if they use these other databases that are available. The other database that states aren't using are federal databases. They should be running comparisons and enter into cooperation agreements with, for example, Department of Homeland Security to check the citizenship status of individuals who are registering to vote to avoid the kind of problems that my county, where I was on the electoral board, had when we found that there were non-citizens who had registered to vote.
So with there's so many issues to keep in mind it sounds like of what we're looking for. Do we sort of have to scrutinize every election intensely, or are there certain sorts of elections that have much higher instances of voter fraud, like rural versus urban versus suburban, or sort of like primaries versus generals? Like, is there any correlation to sort of qualitative features of an election of how much voter fraud will occur?
No, the answer to that is no. Our database is filled with cases in almost every kind of election you can imagine, from state legislative and congressional races to city council and county commission races. I mean, fraud unfortunately occurs in almost every kind of race. There are some clues that can tell you that there's potentially a problem. And I'll give you just one of them, which indicates there's a potential problem and people should be clued in that they perhaps should investigate. One of the cases that I write about in my new paper is the mayor's race in 1997 in Miami. That election was overturned by a court after they found evidence that 5,000 fraudulent absentee ballots had been cast in that election. 55 individuals were actually charged and convicted of fraud because of that 97 race. But the clear indication that fraud was occurring was that the incumbent mayor got the most votes. He didn't get a majority of the vote, so they had to have a runoff. But the incumbent mayor got the most votes of any of the candidates in the race. He got more votes than his main challenger. He beat the main challenger in the votes that were cast on election day. Yet the votes that were cast by absentee ballot favored his challenger 2-1. So the ratio, in other words, the incumbent mayor won by the votes cast on election day, but he lost according to the votes cast by absentee ballot. There's usually not a valid reason for that kind of differential. Normally the candidate that gets the most votes on election day is also going to get the most votes through the absentee balloting process. So when there's a huge, when it's really lopsided between the votes cast on election day and those cast through the absentee balloting process, that's usually an indication that something may have occurred that was unlawful or illegal, and that absentee ballots may have been stolen. And like I said, that's one way of being able to figure out that something happened. When elections are extremely close, that's also when you want to be sure that everything has been done correctly and there haven't been any illegal votes cast.
Thank you again. This might be our last question. We'll just have to see where we are with time. There also seems to be a problem with mail-in voting that is not strictly speaking fraud, but fails to ensure that a vote expresses a citizen's own consent. Many states, for example, prohibit bringing literature into or having another person accompanying a voter into a voting booth to ensure the particular voter expresses consent without influence by others. How can these principles be preserved with mail-in voting?
Well, you can't really. I mean, that's one of the chief problems you find in the proven absentee ballot fraud cases was coercion and pressure brought on people in their homes. And that is one of the biggest vulnerabilities of that kind of voting. You are able to get assistance when you vote in person. There's actually a federal statute as part of the Voting Rights Act that requires states to allow an individual who needs assistance because, they are illiterate or blind or they don't speak English well, to be able to take someone into the poll to assist them. But that law means that someone can help you express your choice. They cannot go into the voting booth and cast the votes for you the way they want to, as opposed to the way you want to. That's called unlawful assistance. And we had cases like that when I was at the U.S. Justice Department enforcing the Voting Rights Act. But there's no way to know if that's happening in people's homes until and unless a problem occurs during the election and investigators actually go out after the election and start talking to actual voters and witnesses, which is a very time-intensive, resource-driven investigation, which is why it doesn't happen a lot. Most candidates just don't have the money to engage in that kind of investigation. Unfortunately, too many prosecutors often aren't interested in doing that.
Well, maybe we have time for one more. Emma, if you want to ask one last, that was quick.
Sure. Are there any resources or nonprofits that you think do like a particularly good job at, like, other than your own research, at like documenting things or advocating for the right sort of changes?
Yeah, there is another one. It's called the Public Interest Legal Foundation. I think I may have mentioned them before, and they've actually done they actually litigate in favor of election integrity all over the country, but they've also issued a series of reports on what they have found in reviewing voter registration lists. Like I said, they issued a report after the 2016 election where they reported on all the aliens that have been found on the voter rolls in the state of Virginia, many of whom had cast ballots, and they've issued similar reports on other areas around the country. So they've actually done some very good research on that. Now, they also just recently issued a great report based on official U.S. Agency data on the number of absentee or mail-in ballots in the last 4 federal elections that have been misdelivered by the U.S. Postal Service, were rejected by election officials when they came back from voters, or are unaccounted for. The states don't know what happened to the absentee ballots, and the numbers are quite shocking. They're in the millions of ballots. So the Public Interest Legal Foundation is the one big other organization I'd recommend people look at their website. They've done a great series of reports on issues like this.
Well, Mr. von Spakovsky, on behalf of the Buckley program, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on these strange circumstances, and I'm glad you're safe and that you were able to join us. So thank you again for the work that you do at the Heritage Foundation. And this was a wonderful event.
Well, I appreciate you having me. My power is still out.
Oh, sorry about that.
I'm sitting at my table with a flashlight on now, but I'm very glad I was able to speak to everyone and that we didn't have to cancel the event.
Thank you so much. You have a good one.
Bye-bye.